we're going to be able to talk about the Black Lives Matter meeting that happened in Lansing yesterday.
We really don't want to be diverse. We want the appearance of diversity, but stuck in the same old system of structure.
There was one perfect marker. There was one. And everyone else has fallen incredibly short of that.
He's recording me. It's threatening myself and my dog.
Yeah, she knew that by calling the police and saying an African American man is threatening me.
Reform the police, defund the police, or abolish the police.
I don't hold it against it every single individual. I have friends that are police officers and I love them to death. But the paradigm that they live in is just not accountable enough.
How many times has a police been called by somebody who was white, on somebody who was black or minority, and they act like they are in distress, and the police show up and they take me away or someone who looks like me because of a phone call?
Without shared power is tokenism. And one of the first things she says, I'm really not a racist.
I sort of think we're in a Hunger Games kind of experience. If you are white, you are living in Pan Am, and you're living in District 1, the whole system is working for you. And if you are a person of color, then you're in one of the other districts, and the system needs to be torn down and totally rebuilt. So this is a classic white mistake. I don't know. Like, Kurt, I feel like I'm doing a lot of talking. Kurt, do you want to explain the mistake for white people saying I'm not a racist?
Well, that's a good question. And now I feel like Andy Shorty, I'm on the spot.
But I feel like that's a lot of people. A lot of people spew out a lot of racist things, but they're like, I'm not a racist.
Racism, as the four of us have defined it, a good definition: prejudice plus power. Who determines George Floyd's value? Jesus did. Fought him with his blood.
Amen.
He determined his value.
The litmus test for white willingness to change is submitting to black leadership.
Cut the military tanks. We don't need those. Keep funding, but it's not as simple as just let's give 150,000 less.
But the police, they police from a perspective and a vantage point that is ancient, archaic, and old, and I say that because it's systemically racist, and we continue to see that.
And if there's not a time when the iron is hot, right now is it. This is why I love talking with you three, is because you and Luis. I mean, I've heard everything Kurt said, but you two just brought up some stuff that I haven't thought about before. If you're watching this and you haven't joined our group core in Lansing, please do so right now. That's how we're in this for the long haul. Well, they cry peace, peace when there is no peace. I'm Tom Arthur. I'm the pastor of Sycamore Creek. I like watching that rolling just because I enjoy listening to Coy laugh.
Me too.
Yeah. I won't be laughing tonight.
You got great laughter. Yeah, you're in.
They're right.
You're in the hot seat tonight because you're leading the conversation. Hey, if you're out there watching right now, give us a shout out in the comments and share this video on your page. Go on, do it right now. Come on, right now, do it. Let's see it. Let's see those shares going up. And just drop a comment in there. Let us know that you are here. Kurt and Coy, did you guys share it out yet?
I did.
All right. So feel free to drop some questions in there. Fix us on what we're not saying right. And while you're at it, like the congregation's Organizing for Racial Reconciliation page to keep up to date about the movement of anti-racist churches growing in Lansing. You may notice a slightly different format tonight. That's because we still can't get Zoom to work with Facebook. So we're just cutting Zoom out. We're doing Restream. So I've never actually used Restream this way, but I'm really excited to do it. We can broadcast out to like 30 places all at the same time.
Wow.
Look at that.
I don't
Technology.
actually have 30 social media accounts to broadcast to, but if I did, I could.
If
So
you
who
did.
are you guys? Introduce yourself.
Pastor Coy Boyer, Kingdom Life Church, right here in Lansing, Michigan.
And Pastor Kurt, Crossroads Church, right in Old Town in Lansing.
All right. You may have noticed that this is called Perspectives. 4 pastors talk about race, and there's only 3 of us. Our good friend Luis Torres isn't able to join us through this run of episodes in October, but next week or the week after that, or sometime coming up here very soon, we are excited to announce that we will have a guest on the show.
Woo!
Jonathan
First one.
Tremaine, president of Civil Righteousness, the group that organized the National Pray on MLK event that all of our churches participated in.
Yep.
At least Kurt, did your church participate in it?
Yeah, they were here.
Yeah, I was on
They had
vacation.
some people
Okay.
there. I actually didn't end up going because I had a fever and I had people from my church, but I went and got tested for COVID and it was negative, but I didn't want to show up with a fever.
We appreciated that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, Jonathan Tremaine has got a few ideas about faith and politics, so we thought he might be worth talking to. I think it's going to happen next week. But tonight, as if talking politics isn't hard enough, how do you apply biblical principles to that conversation? Well, Pastor Coy is going to explain it all to us in 3 simple, easy steps that won't hurt at all and won't take you any time or any money. So, Coy, tell us how to do this.
Well, I'll tell you where it started. I actually was talking to a good pastor friend of mine, and we were talking about the election and everything that was taking place. And he had made the comment that if I really did some research on the Republican National Convention, Democratic National Convention, that I would probably come to the conclusion, like most or like many people have who are Christian or even pastors, that the RNC and their policies are more Christian than the DNC and their policies. So that was one thing. And then the second thing was a very popular pastor came out, not going to share his name, and pretty much made the statement that it would be very difficult for Christians not to vote for our current president if they really believe the Bible, because every good Bible-believing Christian could not really vote for a party that talked about, same-sex marriage and murdering babies, because that goes against Romans 1. So these 2 things kind of like fed the fuel of what was already burning inside of me, because I saw too many Christians on Facebook and social media and on the news and within churches actually unfriending and then going as far as really talk bad about one another because their political platforms and persuasions or preferences. And so some people are actually denying whether or not you're a Christian based upon how you vote, which is preposterous. And so it caused me to kind of dive into this study and try to give a response to my church dealing with biblical principles in politics.
Can we pause just for a second?
Go ahead. What?
You're like some mainline liberal progressive like church, right?
I don't know. No, absolutely not.
You're like you guys are like almost Unitarian, aren't you?
I tell you what, we are Southern Baptist by affiliation, so that's all I should have to say.
Yep.
So I mean, your reaction seems like a lefty reaction, but this is coming from a Southern Baptist.
Yes, sir.
I think that's really important to understand.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. Because I'm Southern Baptist not only by affiliation, but align myself with a good majority of just about, much of their doctrine. Because I grew up General Baptist, so many similarities. But that being said, in all of my training and my time spent with God's word and just living life, I have recognized that oftentimes denominations, groups, organizations, we sometimes miss God in the process of walking with him because of our preferences. So trying to really make sure that we don't miss him because of our preferences. Rather, we are encouraged and challenged when our preferences don't line up with what the Bible says, and we're willing to change our preferences because of what the Bible says, which is what, again, all that prompted this. So yes, that's where we started.
All right.
When we continue
all right.
on.
Yeah.
All right, so I picked the passage, and I didn't know that it was going to actually take off the way that it did in our sermon series, Biblical Principles in Politics, Matthew chapter 22, where the Herodians and the Pharisees get together, two sects of Jews who usually don't agree and would normally actually be fighting one another. They come together with the intent to actually try to trip Jesus and trap him up. They trip him up with a question, that's their intent, hopefully to trap him. Now, they're hoping for one or two things. Either one, Jesus will say something that will make him unpopular with the crowd, meaning either those who would side with the Pharisees or those who would side with the Herodians. Or two, say something that only angers the crowd, but also give them the opportunity to bring him up on trumped up charges to the local government officials because he might actually speak against Caesar. So in some sense, Jesus is in the catch-22. And they come to him and they ask the question, is it lawful for us to pay taxes? Okay. And this is all in Matthew chapter 22. I'm going to read a couple of verses just for context. First says verse 15, the Pharisees went and plotted together how they might trap him in what he said. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians saying, Teacher, we know that you are truthful and teach the way of God in truth and defer to no one, for you are not partial to any. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to give a poll tax to Caesar or not? So these two sects of Jews who don't normally get together or like each other, but find themselves fighting, now decide to band together to actually trap Jesus with a question that will at least the bare minimum cause him to lose popularity. All right. They approach him this way. Jesus, teacher, one who is, we know you are impartial and you do not pretty much lean to the left or side with the right. You say somewhere in the middle. Okay. And they asked him this question about taxes, which, while in and of itself, initially this particular passage isn't all about politics. They use a political question in order to get Jesus to take a side, to actually answer the question and to look bad or become unpopular. And I just think it's interesting to start off that these individuals will bring a political question. And I think they do it intentionally because they recognize part of what they want to do is they want Jesus to lose some of his popularity so people will start following him. So they ask him a question that they know, no matter how he answers, it's going to create division. Period. So I'm going to start there.
Well, first of all, I think to me, it's interesting just from the biblical story. Apparently, taxes is not a new hot topic.
Right.
You know, ostensibly, the United States was started over a protest of taxes.
Yeah.
Although I don't know. I sometimes think that's the way we tell the story, but that's certainly not complete or total. But yeah, I mean, this is like classic religious stuff, religious talk, where religious people try to back each other into corners.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I think about the like a shibboleth. You all know are you familiar with the shibboleth in the New Testament?
The shibboleth?
No. The shibboleth.
No.
Either.
So there was this thing like in Israel, I can't remember, but they would make somebody say the word shibboleth, and it's like a certain part of the people couldn't say it, or they like had a hard time saying it.
Oh, okay.
And it would tell you that you were outside of the region.
Mm-hmm.
And we do that constantly as Christians. We have shibboleths. We say, this is what whoever it was that you were responding to had a shibboleth and said, you can't be a Christian and not vote for the president.
Right.
And that's a shibboleth to tell you who is in and who's out.
Yeah. That's good.
And this is a conversation we probably don't want to go deep into it, but I do think like it is a question of like how much do you have to agree upon to be in fellow with each other, and the three of us all have different like sizes. I will say mine is probably the smallest.
I had that conversation in 2 different meetings today. That same exact question came up. So it's a burning question.
About shibboleths?
No, about like
No.
how, where's the line? How do we, regarding fellowship and, in being in agreement?
Yeah.
And
And I mean, this is a line as well that gets played out right now in race relations or
Right.
racial issues,
sure.
because it's a question of, can a Christian participate with a group that they don't agree with everything that group stands for?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Can you organize your church to participate in it? And I think that's kind of the same thing that's happening here in the story, is these different groups, like one on one side and one on the other, about this issue of paying taxes, are basically saying, like, to Jesus, how much do we have to agree upon here to...
I would go one step further. They're asking who's right. Because the Herodians were actually in the house of Caesar, specifically in Herod's house, and therefore they benefited from the taxes. They were
Right.
Jews who had
Right.
recognized the culture has shifted. We're no longer in control. The Roman government is. So let us find jobs and ways to serve the Roman government and still live our lives as Jews. So they benefited from the taxes. The Pharisees, when Roman government takes over, loses a lot of power because now the temple is not the premier place of final authority. The Roman government is. So the Pharisees look at taxes and the poll tax, especially with Caesar's face on it, as not only a sense of idolatry, but this is absolutely wrong. We shouldn't have to pay taxes. And so when they ask this question, they're hoping to not only, again, they do want to trip Jesus up so they can bring some charges against him, but they also want him to lose popularity. And whatever way he says, if he says pay taxes, the Herodians will say, hurrah, great, we knew it. But then a lot of Jews won't like him because he didn't side with the Pharisees, who were the religious leaders, like the pastors of that time.
Mm-hmm.
But if he sides with the Pharisees and says, no, you shouldn't pay taxes, then that means Herodians not only will be frustrated and he will be picking a side, but now they can, of course, take him before the Roman government and say treason. So what's interesting is they're on different sides of the issue, but they now work together to try to trip Jesus up. And for me, fundamentally, if I want to put this in America time period today, oftentimes what politicians do is they kind of lean on certain principles that are Christian and that affect certain Christians certain ways. And then they say, see, I'm more Christian. So obviously, the RNC will focus more on pro-life. And I think that's part of their platform. So their politicians or candidates will focus on pro-life and try to really appeal to that conservative crowd of Christianity who's really bent and passionate about abortion. On the flip side, the DNC will focus on things like Black Lives Matter, individuals who look like me, who are also Christian and love Jesus, and say, look, we care more about you. And so you should side with us. And so then you got both groups on both sides complaining and arguing, Christians that is, over which one is more Christian. Like, think about that for a moment. Which one is more Christian? Last time I checked, either you're a Christian or you're not. There is no more Christian, less Christian. You either are a Jesus follower, saved by the blood, or not. Unbeliever, believer. There is no more. I'm not more Christian than you guys. I may be more committed than both of y'all put together, but that's a different conversation.
And humble as well.
Right. So there's a lot going on here. One thing I think is interesting is that the Herodians are benefiting from the taxes, and so there is monetary power associated with that. For the Pharisees, there's this kind of moralistic, virtuous power that they don't want to lose. And so they're playing political games, and it's all about power. And this is where they're willing to sell themselves out is for more power, and that is to get rid of Jesus. And so if they can conspire together to really have the power once again, they'll even work together. So their evil intent in this situation brings them together to trip up Jesus. And that really is one of the main problems in American politics is and Christians fall trapped to it.
Yes.
We want power for our morals to be lived out. That's dangerous. What did Jesus do? He died on a cross and laid down his life, and we see power and weakness, throughout Scripture. And so ultimately, Christians have to be careful to be married to a political party for the sake of we want our values lived out. Not that I think we should be a part of that, but not ultimately. Ultimately, our values are lived out in supernatural, spiritual ways, also physical hands and salt and light ways, but not through the means of human power.
Well, here's the other thing. All of our values can't be lived out if we're going to side with one side or the other. Because if you side with one side, certain values that are Christian will be lived out while others are looked over, and vice versa. So, and we see this in Jesus's answer. I mean, Jesus basically says, show me the denarii, it has Caesar's face on it. Give to Caesar what is Caesar, give to God what is God's. In essence, Jesus is saying, first of all, you can honor the government and honor God at the same time in most cases. And generally speaking, as a Christian, you can submit to the government, do what you're asked to do as a Christian, and in most cases, honor God as you honor the government and vice versa. In fact, some can make the argument, and I would too, that by honoring the government, we oftentimes honor God. So that's number one. Number two, Jesus makes a really strong point by saying, show me the denarii, whose face is on it. He's basically saying, listen, if you get certain benefits from Caesar, you got to pay Caesar his due. If he's going to build transportation and roads, if he's going to build, opportunities for you to have jobs and put a police in place and a fire department in place, and he's going to govern the city and take care of it, providing you with certain opportunities, you pay him for it. He's working for it, paying for it. On the flip side, he says, but give God what is due to God. Now, let's be realistic. How do you honor somebody who is responsible for your very life? Like, think about that. How do you give back to someone who is responsible for your very breath?
Right. With all of your life. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all of your life. And so in essence, the Lord is pretty much saying, let me give you an answer to your question without really trying to escape or be very savvy about it. Let me speak truth. And when he speaks this truth by saying, give to government what is government's, taxes, give to God what is God's, your life.
Mm-hmm.
Then what he's also saying in this moment is, and so therefore I've picked my side.
Right.
See, in it, it's like they're waiting on Jesus to pick a side. And even though they want to use it to trip him up and even to trap him, can you imagine what would happen if he actually picked a side to either pay taxes or not pay taxes?
Right.
Years after his death and resurrection, the Herodians, if he had said you're supposed to pay taxes, would be saying, well, Pharisees, Jesus agreed with us when he was here on earth. And vice versa. The Pharisees, had he agreed with them, would have said to the Herodians, now, when Jesus was here, since we all following him now, you were wrong. And oftentimes, man, human beings, even Christians, we have this insatiable desire and this need to feel like God is on our side when we're making decisions and choosing our preferences, when in actual reality, God is not looking to be on our side. He's asking the question, who's on my side?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which goes back to Joshua, when Joshua sees the angel of the Lord about to enter into Jericho, and he says, whose side are you on? You on their side or you on our side? Mm-hmm. You would assume the angel of the Lord would say, I'm on your side because you guys people. The angel is like, no, I'm on the Lord's side. So the question is not whose side is God on. The question is who's on God's side. And neither party, neither platform is truly on God's side. What they do is they do just like most people in the church. We come to God and we like him when it's convenient, comfortable, and it fits our preferences, and we need the church for something. When politicians need our votes, all of a sudden, they real conservative. All of a sudden, Black lives and brown lives and racial equity really matter. Man, talk to me on November the 4th, okay? Then tell me if you really believe all that stuff still.
I think, this little bit of conversation about the taxes is really not the meat of what we're trying to get to here tonight. I don't think you're just laying a foundation.
That's right.
I think, and in some sense, what you're trying to do is you're trying to open space. I'm going to say right of center in the Christian world for the idea that you can be a Christian and not vote for the Republicans.
Absolutely.
That is a legitimate response to the current circumstances or situation from the center right of Christianity.
Absolutely.
And in that sense, I mean, so with this taxes thing that Jesus is encountering, that's one political issue of the day.
Right.
I mean, we don't get a lot of other. I'm trying to even think if there's any other instances where somebody comes and asks Jesus a really blatant political question. And in this one time,
they asked him if he's king.
Well,
and then they crucified him for it.
So.
Yeah.
I was actually just reading that this morning in our New Testament challenge. We were in the last two chapters of Matthew, and Pilate is talking to him, and he says, "You're the king of the Jews," and Jesus says, "You say so."
Yeah.
Which is interesting because it's almost, Jesus saying like, "Well, are you going to say so?" But
I also want to make the point though too that. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Pastor Coy also isn't saying for our Christians on the left, he's also not saying, there could be he is saying there could be a faithful Christian that votes Republican as well.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
So we're not advocating one way or another, at least at this point so far. We're trying to create this.
Is Coy going to get to where he advocates?
I don't know. That's up to him and as spirit leads. But
that's a good point.
There's just as much pushback on either side.
Right.
You're trying to open up space, and I think related to the issue of race, I think you're suggesting that some of the classic right side political issues of the day, which the right likes to focus on abortion and likes to focus on issues of sexuality, or right now it's called religious liberty. And you're saying that some of the issues of the left, like race, you don't want to pick between those. You personally don't want to pick between that.
And I think that you could pick the right view on both and then recognize that regardless to which way I vote, I'm going to somehow miss the right view in one of these areas. As far as, what is the moral thing or what the Bible talks about with regards to life.
So with Jesus, is Jesus' answer a third party? I've always felt like, and when you were talking about that story, it strikes me, and Kurt, something you said, that here's two groups that are usually opposed to each other using their power to keep a third party out. And that just happens. I think the United States system is full of that. For example, the best thing, I think one of the most fundamental things that we could do in our political structure is to implement ranked choice voting, where you rank your vote. It's not a one, you don't just vote for one person, you rank the things you're voting for. And if your top choice doesn't get like a certain percentage of the vote, then your second choice gets thrown in the. Are you guys familiar with that at all?
I'm familiar with it because we talked about it before.
But if we did that, it would totally disrupt the Republicans and the Democrats who have a stranglehold on the political power right now, and they have unified together to keep those sorts of things from happening.
Yeah.
Like Pepsi and Coke.
What's that?
It's like Pepsi and Coke. They made seriously, that duopoly made so much money. They made more money when they had each other because then they keep everybody out, and everything. The competition helped each one of them.
Yeah. That's a good point. And so, you asked the question, is it like a third option? You mentioned the ranked voting, and then what is Jesus, is there a third option out there? And I think that there is a third option, and I think that's where Christians should fall. And that is the option of the kingdom agenda as opposed to American agendas. And so later on in this same story, as you get closer down like verses 37 down to 40, they come to Jesus and they ask, teacher, verses 34, down to 40, what is the greatest commandment? And these are the Pharisees now showing up. They didn't send their disciples, they showed up themselves. And one of them, a lawyer, asked the question, what's the two greatest commandments? What's the greatest commandment? A common question that Jews often debate and discuss because like human nature, we sometimes want to know, hey, if I can only do like one or two things, what was the one thing I should do that is best in the eyes of God? And so Jesus then gives them a statement. He says, you should love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind, all your soul, from Deuteronomy 6:4, the great Shema, 6:4 and 5.
Shema.
And then he gives them the second one is like, you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. I think that's Leviticus 19:2. And here, the concept of loving your neighbor like you love yourself is actually, in some sense, considering your neighbor as yourself and sometimes above yourself. Now, what was interesting about this is when I read this and I preached on it a few weeks back, I said Jesus basically summarizes the kingdom agenda and its platform. Well, I got that because the DNC and the RNC both summarize their platforms. The RNC has about 70 plus pages of their platform and policy, and they sum it up with 6 different statements: restoring the American dream, a rebirth, the constitutional government, America's natural resources, agriculture, energy, and the environment, government reform, great American families, education, healthcare, and criminal justice, America resurgence. Well, the DNC does the same thing, but they summarize theirs with like 10 different statements. So if the RNC does 6, the DNC, we got 10, right? And they got about another 20 to 30 pages where they do the same thing. What I noticed is if I took the summary of both agenda or all platforms, meaning the RNC, the DNC, and then the Kingdom Agenda platform, I realized very clearly that neither agenda, neither platform, RNC or DNC, is really focused on the Kingdom Agenda. Listen, both of them say, well, the Kingdom Agenda says, love the Lord your God with all your heart. Both the RNC and DNC say, listen, we don't have a problem with you loving God. In fact, you can love anyone you want to. Pick one. There's a lot to choose from, which clearly is in defiance to the great Shema. Like, God is saying, I'm the only one. Worship me. There is no competition. So obviously, they both do not follow the primary fundamental commandment that Jesus gives out. Secondly, love your neighbor as you love yourself. In essence, at times, put your neighbor above yourself. That means when I go to do something, buy a car, cut my grass, come in contact with a neighbor, I have to ask myself, how would I want this person to treat me? How would I want to be treated? And then exercise that same care and consideration with them. Well, the American Constitution says you have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In essence, you help yourself as much as you can. And if along the way your neighbor benefits, great. But it's all about me. In fact, in America, we live for 3 people: me, myself, and I. But the Kingdom Agenda says, no, we don't live for me, myself, and I. We live for others as we live a life in humility and obedience to our great God who has saved us. So when I look at that, it's like, oh, neither one of y'all really care about lifting up your neighbor as yourself, and definitely not above yourself. But that's the Kingdom Agenda. And so the question then becomes, which one is really biblical? Which one is really more godly? And when we sum up what they stand for and we sum up the Kingdom Agenda, America has an agenda, but it's just that, the American agenda. It's not God's Kingdom Agenda. And as Christians, our primary focus is God's Kingdom Agenda. And to find a party to do that, one doesn't exist. Well, let me rephrase that. One does exist, and we're already a part of it. It's called the local church in the Kingdom of God. Sorry, I didn't do an hour like I do in my church.
He's Coy's starting to preach there. We give him a pulpit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it brings me back to Jesus, and I do wrestle. I've met with a couple of people from our church, or even asking, "Do we vote at all?" Because they're in line kind of with what you're saying, and we don't see democracy in the Bible, you know. But even like, of course, there's a different government, you know, but right. I'm saying even in the book of Acts, we don't say, okay, everyone raise your hand, and the yeas have it, you know. That's not how its structure is ran, you know. But my point is, when Jesus was talking with the Herodians and the Pharisees and the Roman officials, he really didn't do that much to reform the political agendas. He really was saying, give to Caesar what's Caesar's, and I have a new way, and it's going to transform the entire world. It's the values of it are completely upside down from the values of this world.
Yes.
And I think that's still true today. So I advocate, for many reasons we could get into. I thought one that's interesting. I think Christians should vote for the most part. I understand the Mennonite Amish thing, but one example is Joseph, right? Joseph was in second in command of a pagan government. Daniel actually was in some kind of command. He was an overseer of even like the wicked people that were foreseeing dreams of false gods. He was overseeing them. So there were Christians all over in these political spheres under pagan government structures.
Yes.
So I think we're supposed to be salt and light in it, but it's just interesting. My point is that Jesus, his agenda wasn't a political one. I mean, Nicodemus comes to him. I mean, that was an opportunity to get some political, hey, and he's like, hey, you got to be reborn. You got to be born. And so,
Can you imagine what it would be like if actually Christians were not involved in the government throughout the Bible, or if there was really one side with no Christians on it? Like if all the Christians were on the Republican side and that was it because of his platform, and then the Democrats won. That means there's no God representation in office at all. Like, that blows my mind. The Lord wants his people engaged in the culture and engaged enough in politics and what is taking place, because even when we are not the ones who ultimately control, and the Bible is a driving force of our community, our society, by us being there, we're still, as you said, salt and light. And so Christians have to be on both sides to be an example and a reflection of Christ to that particular side. Beyond that, I understand in doing this series, I understand why Christians would not vote. However, for two reasons, I think it's wise that we do vote. Number one, for me personally, I'm a Black male in America, and our history here in America, there were so many who fought for that right and died that I almost vote as a way to honor the sacrifice of those who fought for me to have this right. So personally, I'm driven to vote, even though I understand what I understand theologically or biblically. And then the second reason why I think it's important that we vote is because if we ever stop voting, because we recognize we're on the third team, meaning we're on the Jesus team, the kingdom agenda, do you realize that if we're not going to vote for neither side, they're really not going to care about us? So sometimes being involved in the process helps them still to consider us as they're making laws. So in some sense, I'm like, man, go out and vote, because if you don't, it won't be as easy to live a quiet and peaceable life in the country in which we currently reside in.
That's a very utilitarian
He always got some big word.
reason, following a very theological and biblical explanation of kingdom values. Am I using big words?
Yeah, but they're good. I know what they mean. So,
okay.
I don't know about the audience. They probably got dictionaries every time. Ready to go.
Coy, you're a smart guy. Like you're well educated. I don't know about Kurt, but
exactly.
I think Kurt got more education than both of us, maybe. What you talking about?
Yeah.
Just keep up with you guys.
Criminal justice.
Yeah.
Look where it got him.
Right.
He's a pastor now. Man, I don't even remember what I was going to say.
I'm sorry. You talk about utilitarian in the midst of a biblical and theological approach.
Well,
answer.
We're getting into like what we were thinking about getting into at the end. And I think that there's some interesting things that come up, or that some resources we can draw on in our Christian tradition, theological tradition, biblical tradition. I mean, one of them, I'm not Reformed, but I'm familiar enough with Calvin's idea of common grace that there is I'm not sure that you can. from a Reformed Calvinistic perspective, say that if Christians were all on one side, then there would be no God representation on the other side, just in the sense that God is still present and active in people's lives, even though they may not fully recognize it or even bend the knee to it, so to speak.
Absolutely.
And in a more Wesleyan framework, that would be considered prevenient grace, that God's grace goes before you and before you're even aware of it, in the sense that you can look back. Many times when you come to make that commitment to follow Jesus and you start to participate in the life of Christ in the Spirit, you can look back on your life and you say, oh my gosh, I see God's fingerprints all over it, but I didn't see it at the time. And that's prevenient grace. And I think there's a way that God's prevenient grace from a Wesleyan concept, or God's common grace from a Calvinistic Reformed perspective, is present in whatever party is, you tend not to think is your party or the Christian party.
Sure.
But when it comes to, I think back to kind of, you're saying like, love your neighbor as yourself. This is one of the most challenging things about whether to vote or not. Like that hurts my head thinking about that from a theological perspective.
Sure.
And
I
a perspective of the tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I think back to Stanley Hauerwas, who is one of the most famous ethics professors and writers of this century, or the last century. He was at Duke when I was there, just at the end of his tenure. And he liked to say that voting was a habit he hadn't kicked yet. And he had those sort of Mennonite Anabaptist leanings. And that kind of, in some way, speaks true to me. And I think about how we Christians lift up democracy as the Christian thing.
Right. Yes.
And if you're Methodist, you don't know your history very well, because John Wesley questioned the American Revolution based on his biblical reading, and the Americans' unwillingness to bend to to submit to the king. And the king, in Wesley's perspective, was biblical. And then Wesley eventually, for those of you who don't know Wesley, John Wesley is the Church of England priest who started the Methodist movement. He's in the 1700s, basically like a contemporary of George Washington. The Methodist movement went gangbusters. Methodists and Baptists went gangbusters in America. And Methodists by the 1800s were ahead of the Baptists, but then we backslid, and the Baptists have took us. But Wesley made the comment that the Lord had seen fit to use such an unbiblical model of government to spread the gospel in America, because it was going so fast in America. But listen, he's saying that democracy is unbiblical, but God is using it. And that blows my mind. I mean, I have a hard time even agreeing with Wesley on that. But my point is just to say that it has not always been a given by significant Christian leaders that we value, and that many of us owe our current ministries to, that democracy and voting was something that was an obvious Christian activity, or the obvious Christian choice. Now, one of the reasons I think that's the case is this idea of loving your neighbor as yourself. Voting is inherently a kind of selfish act, in the sense that you vote for your own interest, sort of constituency.
Most of the time,
And this is where sort of regularly trying to pull this conversation back to race, because that's what we're to talk about. White people don't generally go to the polls and think, how can I vote to improve the lives of other people who are not white?
Well, and black people don't do that either. We don't go to the polls saying, how can I improve the lives of those who are white?
Democracy, well, and it doesn't even have, you don't even have to be about race. But then I do think there is at times, there are ways that different political policies or party platforms, and this is what you're going to get to next, is specific policies.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I vibe with the right's concern for the amount of debt that we're in as a country, and how that debt is ultimately something that we're passing on to our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren to pay. And it feels like right now all we're doing is just kicking that debt can further down and really not having any plan for resolving the debt. And so the right's desire to, to tighten the belt, I think that can be read as a love your future neighbor as yourself, because we don't want to be under crippling debt right now, and we don't want future generations of Americans to be under crippling debt. Now, I think that the Democratic thought, or like policies around, I'm like the environment, or around race, are also loving your neighbor as yourself. Now, I think back to my friend Pastor Sean Holland, who says that the Democrats have a benign neglect of black people, and so policy may on the surface appear to be beneficial to the black community, but in reality is not.
That's often been true.
And that the Democratic Party has often used the black community to keep itself in power by giving lip service to it and then not actually delivering on significant policies that would improve the black community. So
a lot of truth there.
It's like on paper, love your neighbor as yourself, but in reality, perhaps not.
Right.
I talked for a long time. I'm sorry. I don't get nearly as animated as Coy. It's not nearly as entertaining.
I just get concerned when Christians are seemingly more aligned and more evangelical about their political platform than the kingdom. Which one has allegiance in your life? Which one are you? Which one are you advocating more for? Which one do you talk more about? And so we just get out of balance. We're looking for the kingdom to come through our political platform, and that's not how the kingdom comes. So we're supposed to be, like you said, Pastor Coy, whether you're called to the left or to the right, uniquely, to be redeemers of that. But it doesn't happen first through political might and power.
And
that's not how the kingdom comes.
Oftentimes people are trying to bring about their preferences and even the kingdom.
Yes.
The kingdom through their political preferences and alliances. And
absolutely,
that is never going to work.
And then on both sides, they get blinded to really, I think, obvious problems, because they're they're thinking, this is 70% right or correct. And so I got to just be blind to that 30%. I can't speak honest about it. I can't, because I can't go against my political party, or I'm going to, and that's just not the Christian view. We're supposed to be 100% godly no matter what.
Which is why you can be a Republican and say, you know what, I'm part of really Republican because life matters and abortion issue is a big thing. But you can also be a Democrat and say, you know what, life does matter, and they make a strong effort to say that Black Lives Matter. And so you can see on both sides that both at some point are dealing with life and the significance of it, but both also at times do not value life to the same degree, because if the life that they value doesn't fit within the certain group that they are fighting for, then the other lives don't matter as much. And so
I'm gonna throw a bomb in the middle of us.
Throw a bomb.
I just want to recognize, just from my own experience as a pastor with people in my church, that I certainly have people in my church who do not resonate as Christians with the pro-life platform or policy of the Republican National Convention, or whoever it is. And I almost never talk about abortion, except in very small settings with people that I trust, because it's such a hot topic.
It is.
You two inhabit a space like much more right of center than I do. And I have a wide spectrum of Christians who wouldn't all agree on that, which goes back to like the beginning of this conversation about these different Jews who had different views on whatever it is that whatever it is they're bringing to Jesus about taxes. And I don't always know how to resolve that exactly, but I will say that something that has been really interesting to me is that there's almost no awareness of a group inside the Democratic Party called Democrats for Life. And I became first familiar with it because I lived up in Petoskey for 8 years, and Bart Stupak, who was a pro-life Democrat, was the House of Representatives rep for that district, or whatever that's called in Michigan. I can't remember. But it's a really interesting sort of group of people, and I think that it sort of takes out that binary, like if you're pro-life, then you're a Republican, and here are these Democrats who are saying, no, we're pro-life and we're a Democrat. Now, my guess is there's probably also a pro-choice Republicans for pro-choice group as well that's not well known.
Oh, I'll tell you what, maybe there, just like you said, there's a pro-life Democrat group, which would make sense, because if I lean to the left and vote more Democrat as an individual, but I'm a Christian, then I'm going to be a pro-life Democrat. But that means you can also probably have some Black Lives Matter Republicans. Because if you believe in the concept of life, then you can still side with the right and believe that while I'm, for most of the policies and platforms, I do believe in the value of life, and Black lives, brown lives, all lives in the womb and outside of the womb matter. So, and I think that you could find Christians on both sides making statements like that. I'm a pro-life Democrat. I'm a Black Lives Matter Republican. Dude,
my people in the comments are telling me to talk about it, so maybe I'll have to start talking about it more.
Oh, look at that. So your church is saying, talk about it, Pastor. Look at that. They want you to be a real pastor, not a part-time pastor.
Oh.
A full-time preacher, not a part-time preacher.
Talk less, smile more. Don't let them know what you're about, or I shouldn't sing. Our ratings will go down.
Now, I know this. I know that one of the things that we want to get into in one of our next discussions is some of the real issues that seem to be unique to the church. So we want to talk more about the pro-life, and we'll talk about the same-sex marriage and stuff like that, and kind of get into that. Go ahead, Tom.
I think we should, we got 10 minutes or so, and I think we should just look at the comments here.
Oh, yes.
There's a lot of great comments, and just reflect on what people are saying here. Brian Kemp says it's time to separate the words pro-life and pro-choice from pro-abortion and anti-abortion. I'd love to hear Brian say more about what he means there. I will say that that in the Democrats for Life world, the word actually that's used is not usually pro-life. It's actually usually whole life. And I find that to be really compelling set of words, that we're interested in the whole life, from birth all the way to death.
From womb to tomb.
For pro-life, for all life. I think actually it's pro-life to all of life. You guys want to? I don't. Do you understand any more about what Brian's saying there?
He may be saying pro-abortion or anti-abortion because to make the statement with pro-life assumes that you're always pro-life and probably never against any type of killing or murdering taking place. So if you just limit it to anti-abortion or pro-abortion, then you're only dealing with that particular issue, the sanctity of life in the womb, as opposed to pro-life. And that way you can't have people say, well, I'm whole life, I'm womb to tomb type person. He said, no, we're just dealing with abortion. You can separate the issue and make it very, very singular, which is, in some sense could be used to really single out the issue for some good, but it could also be used to kind of help lead people to kind of go in one direction because you single out just that issue. So that's how I'm interpreting it, but I don't know because I don't know Brian.
I don't know Brian either. Do you know Brian, Kurt?
I don't think so.
What's it? Brian what?
Well, Brian, we're glad you're here.
Yes.
Brian what? What was his name?
Brian Kemp.
Like
Kemp.
Sean Kemp.
Man, I think I've heard that name before. Maybe he's local. What else you got?
Well, I'm looking through here. It's a little hard to talk and then read the comments at the same time and keep the conversation
going. 30 seconds. You wasn't reading them, man.
I was trying to listen to you. All right, here, Brett Bateman Lindsay.
Oh yeah, love that guy. He's one of the smartest people I know. So.
Well, he gives a shout out to Hauerwas, so he must not be too bad. Go Blue Devils. I always try to remind my people that in the March Madness is going to be total madness this year.
Yeah.
What is it going to be, like a bubble or something? But anyway, the only official United Methodist school in March Madness is always Duke. So if you're Methodist, you have to root for Duke.
Got it.
Anyway, Brett says, as a religiously uncommitted person, I find myself frequently thinking about the idea of citizenship and whether citizenship in God's kingdom as Christians understand it compromises their citizenship in our republic. Well, I think absolutely.
Yeah, I think he's spot on.
This is one of the things that I've always struggled with. Sort of the strong patriotism and nationalism of really any nation. It doesn't have to be the United States. If you're a Christian. So this reminds me, like, there was this huge debate at Duke when I was there, and I'm sure it's still there, and Hauerwas was at the front of this. He would say that if you have a flag in your sanctuary, your salvation is in question.
Wow.
Wow.
And so there's this huge, like in Methodist circles, like pastors come, this is not just in Duke that you get this sentiment. You would get it also in a lot of United Methodist or mainline seminaries. So pastors go into these small, 80% of United Methodist churches are rural. And they've all got flags in their sanctuaries. So you have this like huge point where you hear, pastors who are in training hear Hauerwas say something like that, and they show up at their small little rural church and they want to remove the flag. And I feel like that the problem isn't the American flag, it's that there's not enough flags. There really should be flags for every nation. This is where I resonate with Mount Hope, the Church of the Flags. And I grew up in Assemblies of God Church where we had flags like that outside because we recognized that God's kingdom transcended. It wasn't, we didn't just fly the U.S. flag because God's church was across all of them.
Yeah.
That's good.
That's good. So here's the thing. I can appreciate a certain level of patriotism to your particular country. And maybe as the church, we should do a better job at saying, hey, if this is the Olympics, there's a certain level of patriotism to your country. If this is something where, you know, it's a country united front, that's one thing. And maybe the church should do a better job at expressing the concept that while the American flag is a flag that represents a group of people who are part of the kingdom, it's just simply that, a flag that represents a part of some of the people who are part of the kingdom of God. That's a good point about Mount Hope, because right, they got like, what is it, like 50 or 60 flags right out front of their church, and it's been there for years. Interesting.
Yeah, I think there can be a healthy side of patriotism. I think the line is nationalism, which I hear more from and see, and it seems to be this idea of, so obviously, I mean, it's one of the main things of put our country first. And I have a hard time with that because we're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves.
Yeah.
So we're supposed to, and that's just a struggle, just right there. It's a theological wrestle. You definitely can't put your country above God. You definitely can't do. If that's your nationalism, then that is heresy. You also can't marry your faith to America, because then you're going to be blinded to what God is doing across the world. You know, so if we think we have more in common with our neighbor who's an atheist than we do with someone from Mexico who's a Christian, we got way more in common with a Christian who lives in Mexico than we do with our neighbor that has all the same cultural values, that looks just like me, that's an American. And we just get that twisted all the time. And so, I mean, to the citizenship question, yeah, our chief citizenship is in heaven. I mean, it's with Christ. He's the king of the kingdom, and we're the citizens of that kingdom first and foremost. We put that first, and we seek that first.
Well, this is where, Kurt, that's just spectacular. I feel like I'm gonna have to go back and find a couple of things you said as the highlight reels. I forget what the other one was, but this one, like that, there ought to be more in common between a Christian American and a Christian Mexican than a Christian American and a non-Christian American. And I just want to reflect on, like, again, the racial components of that. That there is something racial about the fact that I have more in common with a non-Christian American than I do with a Christian Mexican. And let's just remember that in the throne room of heaven, every tongue and every tribe will be represented there, not speaking one language, but every tongue. Like, you know, there'll be a diversity of cultural expression in whatever that worship looks like.
Yes.
And so it shouldn't be the culture that separates us, but rather the diversity of culture unites us in a common object or direction of praise, or object or direction of our life, mission in life.
And you know, you said that, and in heaven, they won't be a Mexican Christian, and we won't be American Christian. We'll just be Christian. I mean, while we can make those distinctions today, just for the sake of the conversation and the fact that we're throwing it in there, when we get to heaven, all nations, tribes, and tongues will be speaking their language, worshiping God, but we'll just be Christian.
We'll maintain ethnicity, though, I would think.
We will. Yeah. I think so.
Our diversity will be there. You're just not going to have these labels of our diversity. Yeah.
It'd be like the church, y'all. But, oh, this is my brother. This is my sister. Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
like
it'll be like your church.
I don't want to get rid of it.
Kurt and my church are just white, which is not like heaven. Let's just be clear about that. Or mostly white. Mostly white. Hey, it's 9:00. You know, I just got to say, like, I think I've said this before. I don't know whether I've said it publicly while we've still been broadcasting, but one of my favorite things about talking to you guys is I get to say all kinds of stuff that I don't get to say as a pastor in my church. Because you guys are not intimidated by me, and you don't do a deferential like, oh, the pastor just said that, so I can't disagree with him. So you pull out of me all kinds of stuff that I keep to myself in my own church, because there's that power difference between clergy and layperson where they will, I don't know, like maybe your church, maybe everybody's okay, like hearing you spout political stuff or political-y stuff, political-ish stuff, and like disagreeing with you and still thinking that they can be part of your church. But that's something I don't know, maybe it's all my own impression. But anyway, I feel really free talking to you guys, and I probably end up saying stuff that's going to come back to haunt me in my own church.
Yeah, so far, they want to hear more of it, they said. So I think you're good. Yeah,
well, Jaria is saying that. Although the last thing she said was, yikes, Tom. I don't know what she's yikesing. But
well, I definitely feel more free when it's not recorded. Just gotta be honest about that. But no, I love you guys, and I think our diversity centered in Christ is a beautiful thing. We need to that needs to be celebrated. Like I love you guys, and I probably have more disagreements with my brother Tom, but I love you. I love your mind. It sharpens me, and so this is healthy. It's healthy for Christians to have honest disagreement as we wrestle and try to work in our sanctification, working out our salvation with fear and trembling. So it's good.
And the beauty is when it's all said and done, whether we agree or disagree on certain things, we all agree on the most fundamental thing, and that is Jesus is Lord. And when we walk away from this conversation, I don't walk away saying, Tom's not really saved. I'm wondering about Kurt's real commitment to Christ. Like it's
right.
That's not. We don't walk away thinking that. I know you guys both love the Lord with all your heart, and you're doing your best to serve Him to the best of your ability, as I am. And in that, it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of picking up, falling down, carrying one another. It's a lot of that.
And not only do I love you guys, but I love your people. Right. And you guys love my people, and not that there are people, but the people that we shepherd, under shepherd.
Yeah. There you go.
And then you start to really get some differences. But but that's okay. Like we're working this out. We're trying to be faithful. I appreciate how you guys are trying to be faithful. That's what I appreciate.
Yeah. Well, hey, before all y'all who are still watching leave, be sure to like the Congregations Organizing for Racial Reconciliation Facebook page. So keep up to date with the growing movement of anti-racist churches in the Lansing region. This is the 10th episode of Perspectives.
Wow.
So what is that? That makes us on par with the Democratic summary?
The summary statement?
Yeah, that's 10. You can find the first 9 as well as short takes on our core Facebook page. I've also been posting them to Sycamore Creek's YouTube page. We're planning for, I think, 2 more of these. Coy, we only got like through 2/5 of your outline tonight. How long was your series?
It was 5 weeks.
5 weeks.
Yeah.
Well, in an hour, we got through 2 weeks of it.
See, look, we summarized it.
Yeah. So we got 2 more. Although next week we're having on our show a guest, Jonathan Tremaine.
Yeah, that's gonna
He's
be
a
good.
pastor, author, actor, and president of Civil Righteousness. He's actually he was in Indianapolis, where I grew up. I had a video chat with him the other day, which was really exciting. And then he moved to Ferguson shortly after all the unrest in Ferguson.
Oh, wow.
He felt called to move there, and then to start this movement, which is called Civil Righteousness. And he's saying, I'm trying to remember exactly. He says injustice requires a civil rights movement, and inequity requires a civil righteousness movement. So the mission of civil righteousness is racial reconciliation and restorative justice through spiritual, cultural, and economic renewal. And their vision is the the restoration of all persons, places, and things while pursuing wholeness and moral excellence according to the biblical pattern. So we really kind of wanted to have him on because admittedly, like all three of us are local pastors before we are thinkers or theologians about politics
Definitely.
and theology in the Bible. I mean, 99% of the time, the things that we are spending our time on don't have anything to do with what we've talked about tonight.
No, they don't.
They have to do with like
the crazy thing
getting enough volunteers for the nursery.
Unless it's a hot year like it is this year.
Yes.
Policies only come up every 4 years, if that. If you get a year off, then that means it's once every 8 years.
Now that's not to say that like at Sycamore Creek we don't talk and reflect on race a lot.
Right.
Sure.
But politics is not. None of us have a PhD in the theology of politics. So I don't know that Jonathan does either, but he has started the civil righteousness movement, which has spread to several cities. And we did the Pray on MLK event that they sponsored or hosted. We held that outside Coy's Church.
Yeah.
And put tape over our mouths. Actually, it was on our masks over our mouths. With one word or two words of sort of protest and prayer.
Yes.
We stood on MLK. So Jonathan will be on next Monday. At least that's plan A. Plan B will be the following Monday, which would be the night before election night. All right. So we will see you next Monday at 8 p.m. And until then, be well and do good.